The flight attendant thought they were just another old couple in the wrong seats. But 2 minutes later, she was off the plane, fired, embarrassed, and exposed in front of everyone. What happened in those 2 minutes changed everything. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The boarding area buzzed softly with the sound of announcements, rolling suitcases, and quiet conversations. An elderly black couple, Harold and Evelyn Bryant, stood near the gate, holding hands as they waited for boarding to begin. Harold wore a well-fitted dark gray coat, a matching cap, and walked carefully with a wooden cane that had his initials carved into it. Evelyn, dressed in a light blue shawl and pearl earrings, stayed close to him, her other hand gently resting on his arm. They weren't flashy or loud. There was a quiet grace to them, the kind that came from years of living with dignity, no matter what the world threw at them. When their boarding group was called, Harold and Evelyn walked slowly toward the gate. The airline agent scanned their tickets and gave a polite nod. As they stepped onto the plane, the flight attendant stationed at the door, Kendra Harper, gave them a quick look. Her smile faltered for half a second. She watched them walk past and toward the business class section, her eyes following them longer than they followed anyone else. Harold and Evelyn reached their row and sat down. Evelyn carefully folded their coats and placed them in the overhead bin. Harold took his time easing into the window seat, adjusting the cushion behind his back. Evelyn leaned over to fasten his seatbelt for him, her voice low and kind as she asked if he was comfortable. The other passengers around them paid little attention, some nodding politely. Everything seemed quiet, until Kendra appeared again, this time walking down the aisle with a clipboard in her hand. She stopped next to them and leaned in slightly, her tone polite but stiff. "Excuse me," she said. "May I see your boarding passes?" Harold nodded and reached into his coat pocket. His hands were a little shaky, but he handed her the 2 printed tickets. She took them and stared longer than necessary. Then she asked, "Are you sure these are your seats?" Evelyn's face shifted just slightly. "Yes," she said, her voice still gentle but firm. "We always fly business. These are our seats." Kendra didn't answer directly. Instead, she handed the tickets back and said, "I just need to check something with the gate. Please remain seated for now." She turned and walked away briskly, leaving a strange quiet around the couple. Evelyn leaned toward Harold and whispered, "That didn't feel right." Harold nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "It's happened before," he said softly. Near the front of the cabin, a man in a navy suit, Marcus Ellison, sat watching the scene. He noticed the exchange. He noticed the couple's calm response, and he noticed Kendra's tense expression. He picked up his phone, typed a message, and hit send. Then he folded his hands and waited. A few minutes passed before Kendra returned, this time with a clipped voice and more urgency. "I'm going to have to ask you both to step off the aircraft while we verify your reservation." Harold blinked. "Step off?" "Yes," she said quickly. "Just for a moment. We'll clear everything up." Evelyn stood up slowly. "We've flown this airline for over 30 years, she said, her voice quieter now, as if embarrassed. "We booked these seats months ago." "I understand," Kendra replied, but her tone had no warmth. "Please come with me." Other passengers were now watching closely. An older man a few rows behind leaned toward his wife and whispered something. A woman across the aisle frowned. Harold struggled to stand, leaning on his cane as Evelyn helped him steady himself. Neither of them argued. They walked slowly toward the front of the plane, holding their dignity as best they could. As the couple stepped off, Marcus put his phone away. His face was calm, but there was something sharp in his eyes. He turned to the flight attendant standing nearby and asked, "Could you let the gate agent know I'd like to speak with a supervisor?" The attendant hesitated, recognizing Marcus. "Of course, sir," she said. Back at the gate, Harold and Evelyn stood quietly near the wall, ignored by most of the busy staff. Kendra was on her phone, speaking in low tones, frustration creeping into her voice. She didn't notice the airport manager walking toward her until he was right in front of her, and she had no idea that Marcus had just triggered something she would never forget. The airport manager, Douglas Price, arrived with a quick but steady stride. He had just stepped out of a meeting when he received a priority message from corporate, flagged as urgent. The name attached to the alert had caught his attention immediately. Marcus Ellison, one of the highest-ranking executives in the company, not someone who made noise unless there was a serious reason. Douglas walked up to the gate, eyes scanning the situation. When he spotted Kendra, he noticed her defensive stance, arms crossed and jaw tight. A few feet away, Harold and Evelyn stood quietly, saying nothing, their presence drawing confused glances from passengers still boarding. "Kendra," Douglas said firmly. She turned quickly, surprised. "Oh, yes, sir. Step over here, please." She followed him a few paces away from the couple. Douglas's voice lowered, but his words were sharp. "Why are those passengers off the plane?" Kendra glanced toward Harold and Evelyn, then shrugged slightly. "Their tickets didn't seem right. I was just being cautious." "Didn't seem right how?" "They're in business class," she said, her voice a little too quick. "I thought there might be a mistake." Douglas narrowed his eyes. "Did you scan the tickets?" "Yes." "And were they valid?" She hesitated. "Technically, yes, but I thought—" "You thought what?" He cut in, his tone rising. "You thought they didn't look like business class passengers?" Kendra's face flushed. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Douglas didn't wait for her to recover. He stepped past her and walked directly to the couple. "Mr. and Mrs. Bryant," he said, addressing them by name. "I'm Douglas Price, Airport Operations Manager. I'm deeply sorry for the inconvenience you've just experienced." Harold nodded, but didn't speak. Evelyn gave a small smile, though her eyes remained tired and wary. "We'll be returning you to your original seats immediately," Douglas said. "There was no issue with your tickets. This should never have happened." Kendra stood frozen near the gate desk, watching as Douglas turned back to her. "You're relieved from duty," he said plainly. "Right now." Her eyes widened. "Wait, what? You were just making assumptions. That's not protocol. That's not training. That's personal judgment. And there's no place for that in this company." Passengers nearby started whispering, and a few pulled out their phones. The atmosphere shifted fast. Kendra's voice dropped, her confidence unraveling. "Can I at least speak to someone from HR?" Douglas didn't flinch. "You'll have that chance, but not while wearing that uniform." He motioned for another staff member to escort her away. Kendra didn't say another word. She walked off the floor, her eyes darting between Harold, Evelyn, and the manager, a swirl of shame and disbelief written across her face. Meanwhile, Marcus had quietly stepped off the plane and approached Douglas. They exchanged a short nod. No need for a long conversation. The message was already loud and clear. Harold and Evelyn were gently guided back onto the plane by another attendant. As they walked back down the aisle, the silence from passengers said more than words ever could. Respect, regret, discomfort, all of it hung in the air. They returned to their seats, moving slowly but proudly. Evelyn helped Harold into his seat again and adjusted his pillow. She glanced toward the front of the plane but said nothing. The look in her eyes was calm but firm, not hurt, not broken, just done with excuses. Back near the gate, Douglas turned to Marcus. "We'll issue an internal statement before the plane lands," he said quietly. Marcus nodded. "Good, but that's just step one." The plane door was secured once again, and boarding was complete. The engines began their low hum as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. Inside the business class cabin, the mood was no longer casual. Something had shifted. Most passengers sat stiffly, stealing glances at Harold and Evelyn without trying to look obvious. The whispers had died down, but the silence carried more weight than words. Harold sat upright, adjusting the small blanket draped across his legs. His cane rested against the seat wall. Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out a small container of mints, offering one to him with a soft smile. He accepted it, nodding in quiet thanks. Neither of them had spoken much since returning to their seats. There was nothing left to say. They'd seen moments like this before. A quiet test of how far respect could be stretched before someone decided it wasn't worth giving. Further down the aisle, Marcus sat back in his seat, his phone resting on the tray table. He had already received a confirmation email from the CEO's assistant. A formal investigation was underway, and his written statement was being drafted by the legal team. His face showed no emotion, but there was a stillness to him, the kind that made people nervous without knowing why. He wasn't loud, but people like him didn't need to be. The new lead flight attendant, Julia, approached Harold and Evelyn a few minutes after takeoff. She bent down gently, keeping her voice low and respectful. "Mr. and Mrs. Bryant, I just wanted to personally apologize for what you experienced earlier. It was unacceptable, and I want you to know that we're taking it seriously. If there's anything at all you need, please let me know." Evelyn looked at her for a long second, then smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said simply. Julia nodded and stood. Before she turned to leave, she added, "There's hot tea and fresh lemon in the galley. I'll bring it for you in a moment." As she walked away, Evelyn looked over at Harold. "She seems genuine," she said. "She does," he replied, "but we've heard apologies before." Evelyn nodded. "Still, it matters how you're spoken to, even if the damage is already done." The couple sat quietly after that, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. They didn't speak of the embarrassment, the removal, or the way passengers had stared. They had carried themselves through worse, but this time felt different. Not because of what happened, but because of how quickly the truth had followed. In the back of the cabin, Julia passed by Marcus and gave a slight nod. She recognized him now. Most of the crew had been informed after takeoff. The man who had made a call before departure was not just a passenger. He was someone who could change the course of many careers, and maybe the culture of the airline itself. While the Bryants rested with their eyes closed, Marcus opened a new message draft on his phone. He wasn't typing to complain. He was preparing the first notes for something bigger. This wasn't just a single incident to be smoothed over. It was the result of patterns. Patterns that needed to be broken. At 35,000 feet, while most passengers sipped drinks or watched silent movies on their screens, the real shift had already started. Quiet, careful, and impossible to ignore. The flight continued steadily, smooth and without turbulence, but the weight in the cabin hadn't lifted. Every so often, a passenger would glance toward Harold and Evelyn, as if checking to see if they were okay. Some looked guilty, others looked curious. No one spoke to them. Not yet. Julia returned with a tray carrying 2 cups of tea, freshly brewed with slices of lemon on the side. She placed them down gently on their tray tables. "I added a bit of honey," she said softly. "Let me know if it's too much." "Thank you, dear," Evelyn said, her voice calm but cool. Julia nodded and stepped away, understanding that kindness didn't erase the morning. Back in the galley, Julia leaned against the wall and exhaled. Grace, another attendant, glanced at her. "They're settled?" she asked. Julia nodded. "Yes, but that couple, they weren't just passengers. They're known names in our records. Harold Bryant helped fund our senior access program 5 years ago." Grace blinked. "You're serious?" Julia nodded again. "He's been with the airline longer than most of us have worked here." Grace shook her head slowly. "Then what was Kendra thinking?" Julia looked down, her expression hard to read. She wasn't thinking. She was assuming. Up front, Marcus remained still, reviewing the notes now saved on his phone. He had already sent a quiet alert to the company's Equity and Compliance division. The issue was no longer just about a single employee's behavior. It was about what allowed it to happen so casually. The mistake had been made in public. So would the consequences. He tapped his screen and began writing an internal memo. "Flag this as a failure in frontline judgment and training. Incident involved platinum executive passengers with flawless history. Flight staff made removal based on visual assumptions alone. Investigate previous reports involving same employee. Recommend fast-track disciplinary review." He saved the draft, knowing the weight it carried. When someone at his level sent a message like that, it didn't disappear into a folder. It created meetings, urgent ones. An hour passed. The flight remained quiet. Evelyn read a magazine without much focus, and Harold closed his eyes, though he wasn't sleeping. Every few minutes he would shift slightly, adjusting his legs, his cane resting nearby like a quiet witness to everything they'd just been through. The man seated across the aisle from them leaned over slightly. "I saw what happened earlier," he said gently. "I'm really sorry." Evelyn looked up, surprised for a moment. "We all saw it," the man continued. "It wasn't right, and I wanted you to know that." Harold opened his eyes and gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said. "It means something." The man leaned back, saying nothing more, but his words hung in the air. The first voice from the crowd willing to speak. One small ripple. But sometimes that's all it takes to break the silence. Another hour passed, and the plane continued to cruise through clear skies. Drinks were served, meals distributed, and conversations began to pick up again. The earlier tension hadn't vanished. It had simply tucked itself under the surface, quiet and waiting. Yet in that silence, something had shifted. Near the front, Marcus received a message from his legal advisor. Review board has been notified. Human Resources has opened a formal incident report. Internal policies under immediate review. Do you wish to make a public comment? Marcus didn't respond right away. He read the message twice, then closed his phone. Timing mattered. Speaking too soon could look like a headline. He didn't want a reaction. He wanted results. Across the aisle, Harold glanced at Evelyn. She could feel his eyes before he spoke. You all right? She gave him a small nod. Yes, but I'm still thinking about it. About her, he asked. She shook her head. About how quickly it happened. How simple it was for her to decide we didn't belong. Harold didn't answer right away. He took a sip of his tea, now lukewarm, and placed the cup back down. She didn't even ask herself if we'd been here before, Evelyn continued. She just saw us, and that was enough. He looked at her, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. It's always enough for people like that, he said quietly. Further down the cabin, a younger woman who had seen the whole incident finally stood up. She walked over to Julia in the galley and spoke in a low voice. Was that couple put back in their seats? Julia nodded. Yes, ma'am. The woman glanced back toward Harold and Evelyn. I don't know them, but I know what I saw, and that shouldn't have happened. Julia listened, her hands stilling over the tray she was preparing. The woman added, That flight attendant, she looked right at them like they were trespassing, and no one stopped her. Julia's jaw tightened. She's been removed. She won't fly again until this is over. Maybe not ever. The passenger nodded. Good. Someone needed to see it from the beginning. Someone needed to see how fast it happens when you're just trying to exist. Meanwhile, Marcus opened his phone again. He wrote a short reply to his legal team. No public comment. Yet, let the company move first. But if they fail to act fast, prepare full statement with names, dates, and timeline. He hit send and leaned back, closing his eyes for the first time during the flight. The woman returned to her seat, pausing briefly beside Harold and Evelyn. She placed a small note on their tray table, folded neatly, and gave Evelyn a soft smile. Then she walked back to her row without saying a word. Evelyn opened the note carefully. It read, You were seen. You were believed. You deserved better. Her hand trembled slightly as she folded it back up and tucked it into her purse. She didn't speak, but her eyes filled with something close to peace. Not comfort, but recognition. Harold placed his hand over hers. They didn't need to speak. Some moments carry their own voice. The hum of the engines remained steady as the plane glided through the sky. But the atmosphere in the cabin had taken on a different tone. Conversations were softer, glances more deliberate. The earlier disruption lingered like a shadow in the corner of everyone's mind. Not loud, not dramatic, but unforgettable. Harold rested his head against the seat. He wasn't tired, but his body had learned long ago how to be still, especially in moments when patience was the only armor. His cane leaned slightly against the seat back in front of him, his hands folded over his lap. Evelyn reached for a tissue and dabbed her eyes gently, not because she had cried, but because the emotion had sat too close for too long. She looked at her husband and said quietly, Do you remember that trip to Chicago? First time we flew business class. Harold smiled faintly. Of course, you wore that green scarf, the one with the little gold pins. She nodded. And that young flight attendant kept refilling our tea every 10 minutes. Thought we were some kind of royalty. She said we reminded her of her grandparents. Harold chuckled softly. It was different back then, Evelyn murmured. Or maybe we were just lucky that day. Harold didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew that what happened earlier wasn't new. It wasn't surprising, just disappointing. And worse, familiar. Behind them, a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a short-sleeved shirt, with headphones around his neck, slowly leaned toward a nearby passenger. He spoke in a low voice. "I've never seen anything like that." They didn't say a word when they were told to leave. Just got up and walked out like they'd done it 100 times before. The woman beside him replied, "That's probably not the first time they've been treated like that." He paused. "That's what I mean. The way they didn't fight it, it's like they expected it." Neither of them spoke after that. At the front of the plane, Julia stepped into the cockpit briefly, speaking with the captain. Her voice was calm, but her expression was serious. The captain nodded, reached for the overhead communication switch and pressed it. A moment later, the cabin speakers came on. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to take a brief moment to address something that happened earlier on this flight. Some of you may have witnessed it, and for those who didn't, it's important we say this clearly. All passengers aboard this flight deserve to be treated with equal respect and dignity, no matter what they look like, where they sit, or how they travel." There was a brief pause. The sound of the engines continued under his voice. "The airline is taking the earlier situation very seriously, and I want to personally apologize to those directly affected. We will make this right." The intercom clicked off. The silence that followed was heavy, not awkward, but meaningful. Heads turned slightly. Some passengers looked at Harold and Evelyn. Others looked down, unsure what to feel. But it was no longer something to ignore. Marcus glanced at his phone again. Another message came in, this time from the Vice President of Operations. "We've reviewed the preliminary report. Full internal review is underway. Legal wants to debrief with you upon landing. Do you want to join?" Marcus typed a single reply. "Yes, and this time, I'm not staying silent." Meanwhile, back in business class, Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather journal. The cover was worn, the pages lined with careful handwriting. Notes from their travels, names of cities, quiet moments worth remembering. She opened it to a blank page and began to write, slowly and carefully. March 27th, Flight 894. We were seen. We were questioned. Then we were heard. For once, someone didn't wait too long to listen. She looked over at Harold. He was already watching her, a faint smile on his face. She smiled back. Outside the windows, the sky stretched wide and clear. Inside the cabin, something had changed. Not completely, not enough to fix everything, but just enough to remind them, and everyone watching, that silence wasn't always the safest seat. The minutes moved slowly as the plane continued its course, but something about the air felt different now. Heavier in some ways, lighter in others. There was no dramatic shouting, no confrontation left hanging in the aisle. Instead, the weight of quiet reflection settled over the passengers like a blanket they hadn't asked for. Conversations had softened, and eyes had turned inward. A moment of bias, brief and casual to some, had now forced an entire cabin to confront something most pretended wasn't real. Harold looked out the window, his gaze steady. The clouds outside rolled slowly beneath them, silent and endless. He had always found peace in flying, the way the world seemed smaller from above, how the noise faded at 35,000 feet. But not today. Not after what happened. Today, the clouds didn't bring peace. They only reminded him that no matter how high you flew, some things always followed you. Evelyn closed her journal gently and placed it back in her purse. She turned toward him and said softly, "Do you think she regrets it?" Harold didn't turn his head. "Which one?" "Kendra." He thought about it for a long moment. "Regret's easy when people are caught. The real question is whether she understands why she was wrong. That's the part most people miss." Evelyn nodded slowly. "It's not about the mistake. It's about the belief behind it." Meanwhile, in the first row of economy class, a college student named Rafi sat quietly, scrolling through a thread on social media. He had posted earlier, during boarding, describing what he witnessed. The elderly couple removed, the uncomfortable silence, the flight attendant's tone. His post had started to gain attention. Comments were flooding in. "Unbelievable. This keeps happening. People need to stop acting surprised. Tag the airline. Hold them accountable." Rafi bit his lip as he read. He hadn't meant to start anything, but seeing it unfold in front of him, Watching two kind, elderly people being questioned without cause had shaken something in him. He refreshed the screen. The post had crossed 12,000 likes, and counting. Further ahead, Julie and Grace quietly discussed the aftermath. They stood behind the curtain in the galley, voices low. She should have just asked herself one question, Grace said. Would she have done that if they looked like someone else? Julia didn't answer right away. She poured 2 cups of water and handed one to Grace. You know what gets me, she said finally. It wasn't even what she said. It was how she looked at them, like they were doing something wrong just by sitting there. Grace nodded, her jaw tight. That look is what people remember. Julia leaned against the counter, tired. I hope this isn't just about her losing the job. I hope they actually change something. They have to, Grace replied. Too many people saw it. This one won't go quiet. In business class, Harold leaned his head back again, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't angry. He'd long passed that point in life. But he was tired. Not physically, but in a deeper, heavier way. Tired of being expected to handle things gracefully every time someone else's ignorance decided to test their patience. He remembered moments just like this, at restaurants, in hotel lobbies, even on trains. Every time Evelyn would grip his hand a little tighter, and he'd force a smile to show the world that they were okay. But behind that smile was the same silent question. When does it stop? Evelyn reached for his hand again now, sensing the weight of his thoughts without needing to ask. He looked at her, and their eyes met. Not with sadness, but with something stronger. The kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. A few rows behind them, the man who had spoken earlier leaned over to his wife and whispered, I hope someone tells the whole story. His wife replied, They just did. Without saying a word, the captain made another short announcement. Just weather this time, and an update on landing. But even that simple message couldn't wash away the undercurrent of awareness now flowing through the cabin. At the back of the plane, Marcus finally stood and walked toward the galley. Julia straightened when she saw him. Is everything all right, sir? Marcus looked calm as always. You've handled things professionally, he said. I just wanted to say that. She blinked, surprised. Thank you, sir. He paused for a moment, then added, Make sure your report is honest. All of it. Don't leave out the passengers who saw it, or the silence from the others. That matters just as much. Julia nodded. I understand. Marcus walked back to his seat, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. But in his mind, every part of this moment was being recorded. The report, the timeline, the tone of voices, the looks exchanged. It would all matter. Because some stories don't need to be shouted to be powerful. Some are loudest when they're quiet, witnessed, remembered, and impossible to ignore. The flight began its slow descent, and the seatbelt signs lit up. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced grace, checking overhead bins, reminding passengers to stow their trays and return their seats upright. But no one really paid attention to the safety reminders. Most were still thinking about what had happened earlier. You could feel it in the way people sat. A little stiffer, a little quieter, eyes moving more than mouths. In business class, Harold adjusted the buckle of his seatbelt with slow, steady hands. Evelyn leaned over and helped smooth the lap blanket over his legs. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her movements were soft but full of unspoken care. He looked at her, then down at her hands. That same hand had carried him through hospital stays, long drives, funeral halls, and courtroom benches. Now it held him through something as ordinary and as exhausting as a plane ride. The note from earlier, the one the young woman had left, sat inside Evelyn's purse. She hadn't looked at it again, but she could still hear the words in her head. You were seen. You were believed. You deserved better. She wasn't used to being seen, not like that. Not without having to ask. Further back, Rafi refreshed his phone screen again. The post had now gone viral, over 60,000 interactions. Verified accounts were beginning to share it. Even a few well-known figures had commented. This is what racial bias looks like in real time. Glad someone spoke up. Don't let this get buried. Someone had tagged a news outlet, then another. The story was moving faster than he expected. His hands trembled slightly as he locked his phone and looked around the cabin. From the outside, it looked like a normal flight, just another landing. But he knew something bigger was happening. This wasn't just about two people being mistreated. It was about how everyone else reacted when they saw it. Back in the galley, Grace leaned against the counter, folding her arms. "He's one of them, isn't he?" she said to Julia. "Who?" "That man in seat 1A, Marcus Ellison." Julia nodded slowly. "He's not just with the company, he's high up. Legal affairs, corporate ethics division." Grace exhaled. "So he saw everything." "He saw enough." Julia paused, then added, "And now everyone else will too." At that moment, the intercom chimed again. The captain's voice came over, calm and direct. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in approximately 10 minutes. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all personal items are stowed. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us today." Evelyn stared straight ahead. Her hands rested gently on the armrest between her and Harold. She didn't know what would happen when they landed. Whether someone would be waiting to speak with them, or if they'd simply be allowed to walk off like nothing happened. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let this go unnoticed. Harold reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small leather wallet. From it, he took a folded business card, worn and creased at the edges. On the back was a name and a direct phone number. It belonged to the airline's board liaison, someone he had met years ago at a charity gala when they were launching a program for senior travelers. He looked at the card, then tucked it into his shirt pocket. "What's that for?" Evelyn asked, glancing down. "Just a reminder," Harold said, "that we're not powerless, even when people treat us like we are." The wheels lowered beneath the plane with a loud hum, signaling the final stretch before touchdown. A low murmur rippled through the passengers as they braced themselves for landing. In row 6, the woman who had left the note sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. She didn't look back at the couple. She didn't need acknowledgement. She just hoped they knew someone had their back, even if it was a stranger. Marcus sat upright, seatbelt fastened, phone in hand. The screen showed a draft email already typed out and addressed to the CEO and the internal leadership board. The subject line was clear. "Incident report, Flight 894, urgent action required." He hadn't hit send yet. He was waiting for the landing, for the moment the plane touched the ground. That's when his work would begin. Not with complaints, not with threats, with change. Real, structured, unavoidable change. The plane lowered through the clouds, the city lights below growing brighter. And inside that cabin, full of strangers, secrets, assumptions, silence, and one terrible mistake, every passenger waited, each in their own thoughts, knowing that what had happened on this flight would not end at the runway. It had already begun to follow them. The plane landed with a smooth, practiced jolt. The tires met the runway with a deep rumble, and the brakes hummed as the aircraft gradually slowed down. Outside, a drizzle had started. Raindrops tapped against the windows, faint but steady, streaking down the glass as the plane taxied toward the gate. Inside, no one moved or spoke until the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign switching off echoed through the cabin. Passengers unbuckled belts and reached for bags, but it wasn't the usual impatient scramble. Movements were slower, conversations were hushed. It wasn't just the landing that had people on edge. It was the sense that something unfinished was waiting on the other side of the door. Harold remained seated, his hands resting on his lap, fingers slightly curled around the handle of his cane. Evelyn didn't move either. They sat quietly, watching others begin to gather their things, neither in a hurry nor unsure. They had decided, without saying it, that they wouldn't be the first to leave, not after being the first to be removed. In the aisle, Raffi pulled his small backpack from under the seat. He glanced over at Harold and Evelyn, then lowered his eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. He still hadn't posted anything more since the flight took off, but his phone buzzed with notifications every few seconds. A message popped up from a journalist. "Saw your thread. Would you be open to a statement?" He didn't reply. Not yet. This wasn't about going viral. This was about something real, and it deserved more than a few lines online. Up front, Marcus remained seated as well, his laptop now open on the tray table. His hands moved quickly, fingers pressing keys with quiet urgency. He was finalizing the internal report. Every detail was included. The moment Kendra approached the couple, the exact time they were asked to leave, the passengers who saw it in the specific sections of the company's anti-bias training policy that had clearly been ignored. He finished the report, attached the relevant timestamps and witness notes, and paused only for a second before hitting send. The email disappeared into the system, copied to the CEO, the legal team, the board, and one senior advisor who handled internal investigations. This wasn't a complaint, it was documentation. And in his position, documentation carried weight, the kind that moved departments, shut down cover-ups, and forced policies to change. As the plane came to a complete stop, Julia stood at the front of the cabin. Her voice came over the intercom, calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your destination. Please remain seated until the main doors have been opened and the aisle is clear." She stepped out of the galley, walked through the aisle with quiet authority, and stopped by Harold and Evelyn's row. She knelt slightly, just enough to meet them at eye level. "I've been told that a team from the airline will be waiting just outside the gate," she said softly. "They've been briefed. They'll be speaking with you directly, if that's all right." Harold nodded once. "Thank you." Evelyn looked at Julia, her voice soft but clear. "Did you know before we boarded who we were?" Julia hesitated. "No, ma'am, I didn't." Evelyn gave a faint smile. "Good. That means you treated us with respect because you chose to, not because you were told to." Julia's eyes welled slightly, but she held her voice steady. "You deserved nothing less." Further back, passengers began to gather in the aisle, but many looked back toward the Bryants, unsure if they should go or wait. The couple's quiet strength had commanded the entire cabin, not through anger or demands, but through the simple act of existing with grace, even while being wronged. The main door opened with a click, and the first rows began to exit. As they passed, a few passengers stopped briefly to nod at the couple. A woman in her 60s placed a hand gently on Evelyn's shoulder and whispered, "We saw you." "I'm sorry." A younger man simply said, "That should never have happened," before moving on. Even those who didn't speak left the plane a little quieter than they had entered it. You could see it in their eyes, the way they looked at Harold and Evelyn, not with pity, but with something closer to understanding, and maybe guilt. When it was finally their turn to stand, Harold rose slowly, gripping the armrest for balance. Evelyn picked up their small carry-on and handed him his coat. They stepped into the aisle as a unit, one step at a time, never rushing, never shrinking. As they neared the door, Marcus also stood. He didn't say anything to them. He simply gave a respectful nod, the kind that passes between people who understand what isn't said aloud. Then, standing just outside the aircraft door, were three individuals, one in a dark gray suit holding a clipboard, another with a staff badge clipped to her blazer, and a third man holding a leather portfolio. Their faces were serious, but their posture was deferential. The woman in the blazer stepped forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Bryant," she said gently, "I'm Alicia Stone, from the Executive Relations team. We're deeply sorry for what happened today, and we'd like to speak with you privately before you leave the terminal." Harold looked at Evelyn, then nodded once. "Lead the way." And with that, they stepped off the plane, not as passengers who had been removed, but as people who had been wronged, and were now being met with the beginning of something that looked, finally, like accountability. The hallway just outside the jet bridge had been cleared. No passengers lingered. No staff milled about. The usual hustle of arrivals was held at a respectful distance. Harold and Evelyn walked with slow, steady steps, side by side behind the airline representative, Alicia, who guided them through a private security corridor toward a quiet conference room tucked behind the terminal's main concourse. Alicia's voice was calm, but there was urgency beneath it. "We've arranged a private space so you won't be disturbed. There are some things we'd like to go over with you, and the Vice President of Customer Relations will be joining us shortly." Evelyn nodded politely, but her expression gave nothing away. She was past the point of small reassurances. She had been in enough rooms like this to know how companies handle damage control. Soft tones, bottled water, and lots of carefully chosen words that sounded like apologies but landed like excuses. Harold didn't speak. He walked upright, eyes forward, one hand gripping his cane, the other lightly brushing against Evelyn's elbow with every step. The air was cool in the hallway, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows behind them. Inside the conference room, the table had already been set. A tray of tea and bottled water, leather chairs. A folder of printed documents sat neatly stacked in front of one seat. A second after they entered, the door opened again. A tall man with silver hair, pressed shirt, and a tight corporate smile stepped in. He extended a hand with practiced ease. "Mr. and Mrs. Bryant, I'm Daniel Reeves. I want to thank you for agreeing to speak with us. First and foremost, I want to express my sincerest apology for what you experienced on Flight 894. I've reviewed the preliminary incident notes, and I assure you, what happened should never have occurred." Harold didn't take the offered hand right away. He glanced at Evelyn, who gave a slight nod, then shook Daniel's hand briefly before taking a seat. Evelyn followed, folding her coat neatly in her lap. Daniel sat across from them, his posture respectful but stiff. He cleared his throat. "Before we proceed further, I want you to know that the employee involved, Kendra Harper, has been immediately suspended, pending full review. The onboard manager made the call to remove her from duty after reviewing passenger accounts and verifying your tickets." "We know," Evelyn said calmly. Daniel looked slightly thrown by the interruption, but recovered quickly. "Good. Transparency is important to us. We're currently conducting a thorough internal review. We've spoken with several passengers. Some, including a corporate observer who happened to be aboard, have already filed formal reports." "Corporate observer," Harold repeated slowly. "You mean Marcus Ellison?" Daniel blinked. "Yes. You know him?" "We've crossed paths," Harold said with a faint smile. "Years ago. Fundraising event for the Veterans Access Program. He was new then." Daniel looked momentarily embarrassed that he hadn't known that piece of history. "Of course, I see." Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her voice still gentle, but steady. "We've been flying this airline for nearly 4 decades. Always the same route. Always business class. We've never caused a delay. Never asked for special treatment. And yet today we were treated like intruders. Without question, without dignity. Do you understand the difference between a mistake and a pattern, Mr. Reeves?" Daniel opened his mouth, but Evelyn wasn't finished. "We're not angry because someone misread a seat number. We're angry because the moment she saw us, she made a decision. That we didn't belong where we were sitting. That something must be wrong. Not with the system, but with us." Harold sat quietly beside her, nodding in agreement. He hadn't raised his voice either. He didn't need to. The room had already shifted around Evelyn's calm, powerful words. Daniel swallowed hard, setting down the pen in his hand. "Mrs. Bryant, you're absolutely right, and I won't insult you by pretending this can be undone with a statement or a voucher. What happened exposed failures, on the individual level and within our internal systems. We want to make this right, not just for you, but for what you represent." "And what is that?" Harold asked, voice low. "Loyalty, patience, dignity," Daniel replied, "and the thousands of other passengers like you who fly without recognition, but deserve better." He opened the folder in front of him. Inside were several items: a formal apology letter signed by the CEO, a printed commitment plan outlining new training protocols, and a drafted public statement acknowledging the incident. "We want your input," he continued. "We want this to be more than an internal correction. We're not asking you to fix this for us, but to help make sure we don't repeat it." Evelyn reached for the folder, her eyes scanning the first few lines. She said nothing for a long time. Then she looked up and asked, "And if we don't agree? If we say your statement isn't enough?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Then we go back. We revise it until it's right." Harold leaned back, letting the moment settle. He had heard many promises over the years. Most were made to quiet a story, not to change a system. But something about the tension in Daniel's shoulders, the way his hands stayed open on the table, suggested this wasn't just about public image, at least not entirely. Finally, Harold said, "Then let's start with the wording. Because I'm not interested in an apology that sounds like it was written for everyone. I want one that sounds like it was meant for us." Daniel nodded. "Understood." Outside the room, the airport bustled like normal. Travelers hurried to gates. Announcements echoed overhead. But inside, something rare was happening. A conversation where the truth wasn't being softened. A moment where two voices, long ignored, were finally being heard without interruption. And that alone made the silence worth breaking. Time moved slowly inside the quiet conference room, though the airport beyond its doors churned on like any other day. Luggage wheels rolled. Boarding groups were called. Families hurried toward connections. But within those four walls, the conversation between Harold, Evelyn, and Daniel took on a rhythm that had nothing to do with gate numbers or boarding times. It was the rhythm of people finally saying what had gone unsaid for years. Evelyn read each page of the proposed public statement, word by word. She didn't skim. She didn't rush. The paper in her hands held more than a corporate message. It was, to her, a test of sincerity. She looked for what was missing, not just in the phrasing, but in the tone. The language was clean, professional, and apologetic, but it was cautious, too cautious. "This sounds like you're sorry that people found out," she said finally, placing the paper down. "Not that it happened." Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly. Not defensively, but like someone who already suspected he'd hear those words. "I understand," he said quietly. "We had legal review the draft before it reached you. Their job is to minimize liability, but that shouldn't come at the cost of honesty." Harold leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his cane laid across his lap. "Here's what I know, Daniel. You'll say what your lawyers allow. You'll offer vouchers. You'll retrain your staff. And then in a month or two, if the headlines die down, everyone goes back to doing things the old way, until it happens again, to someone who doesn't have a connection, or a name, or enough witnesses willing to speak." Daniel didn't argue. He didn't shift in his chair. He simply looked across the table and said, "That's what we're trying to stop." "And you're right. It shouldn't take influence to be treated properly." Evelyn pulled the folded note from her purse, the one given to her on the plane by the young woman. She unfolded it carefully and placed it on the table between them. "You know why this meant more than anything in your folder?" she asked. Daniel glanced at the words written in pen. "You were seen. You were believed. You deserved better." Evelyn tapped the paper with her finger, because she had nothing to gain by writing this. No title, no script, no camera. Just decency. That's what your employees need more of. Not policy refreshers, not 6 slides on unconscious bias. They need to be reminded that every person who steps on your planes deserves to feel like they belong. Daniel nodded slowly, his expression tight. "We've started reviewing internal training protocols, not just customer-facing modules. We're adding live scenarios, real-world footage, and this incident will be part of it." Harold's eyebrows lifted. "You're putting us into your training?" "Only with your permission," Daniel said. "Not just what happened, but how it was handled and how it should have been handled. And more importantly, how you responded. You didn't shout. You didn't demand anything unreasonable. You didn't make threats. But you made us listen. That matters." Evelyn folded the note again and tucked it back into her purse. "Use the story," she said, "but don't turn us into a cautionary tale. We're not the warning. We're the example of how people survive disrespect with dignity." Daniel began taking notes. For the first time, his posture eased, not because the meeting was ending, but because something real had broken through the polished script he'd arrived with. Harold shifted in his seat and said, "There's one more thing. We don't want this to end in private. Not just a closed meeting, a quiet apology, and a digital signature on a training packet." "What do you have in mind?" Daniel asked. "A meeting with the CEO," Harold replied, "face to face, not just for us, but with members of your leadership team, your hiring director, your training leads. I want to know what kind of culture you're building behind your name." Daniel paused. "I can arrange that." Evelyn added, "We want a follow-up, not just promises. We want a timeline, metrics, proof. Not because we need compensation, but because if you don't change this, someone else will suffer it next, and they may not have the voice or the patience to wait for your apology." Daniel nodded, more firmly this time. "Understood. We'll schedule the meeting within the week." He stood, and so did they. No handshakes this time. Not yet. The moment was too heavy for formal politeness. The weight of the past hours, the humiliation, the removal, the unexpected vindication, still lingered between them. As Harold and Evelyn exited the room, Daniel followed them partway down the hallway, watching as they disappeared around the corner, escorted quietly by Alicia toward the main exit. Inside the conference room, the papers on the table fluttered gently beneath the air vent. The public statement remained half-edited, the apology letter unsigned. But for the first time that day, it felt like something had truly started. Not with policy, not with press, but with truth, and two people refusing to let that truth be smoothed over. Outside the terminal, the evening air was cool and damp, the earlier drizzle turning into a soft rain that tapped against the pavement in rhythmic drops. Cars pulled into the pickup lanes one after another, headlights glowing through the mist. The city buzzed quietly beyond the glass walls of the airport, unaware that something rare had unfolded behind the gates. Not just a mishandled flight, but the beginning of a reckoning. Harold and Evelyn stood side by side beneath the covered exit, their small suitcase resting between them. They had declined the black car service arranged by the airline. "We're not here for ceremony," Harold had told Alicia. "We just want to get home like everyone else." Now they waited for a taxi like they always did. No fanfare, no announcement, just presence. Evelyn pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the wind picked up. She looked up at her husband. "You think anything will come of it?" Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Something already has." She tilted her head. "How do you mean?" He turned to her, voice steady. "They saw us, not just the airline, the people, on that plane, in that room, watching online. They saw what it looks like when someone crosses the line and you don't yell, don't scream, don't back down, just stand there and don't move. That's what stayed with them." Evelyn gave a soft hum, the kind that meant she agreed, but wasn't ready to let it settle. "But will they remember?" she asked. "They won't forget," he answered, "because we didn't let them pretend it didn't happen." A yellow taxi pulled into the lane. The driver stepped out, popped the trunk, and gave a small nod as he recognized them. Not as celebrities, not as passengers who had made a scene, but as people who had been watched, wronged, and respected. They got in without a word. As the car merged into the stream of vehicles, Evelyn looked out the window. The city lights blurred past. Street lamps, signs, buses, each one flickering like a passing thought. Her phone buzzed in her lap, a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Bryant, this is Julia, the flight attendant. I just wanted to say thank you. You didn't know me, but you reminded me why I took this job in the first place. I saw how you handled everything. I won't forget it." Evelyn stared at the message for a long time before turning the phone face down. "One of the crew," she said softly. "She thanked us." Harold nodded but didn't respond. He was watching the passing buildings, deep in thought. Meanwhile, across the city, in a quiet office on the top floor of the airline's headquarters, Marcus sat at his desk. He had skipped dinner. There were still 2 meetings left on his schedule, one with the legal team, the other with corporate communications. But his mind was on none of them. The report he had filed after the flight had been reviewed, acknowledged, and forwarded to the compliance division. But it was more than a report now. It was the beginning of a broader audit, a review of all similar complaints in the past 5 years, with a focus on how they were handled and whether patterns had been ignored. A list was already being compiled. He stared at the screen in front of him, reading the last paragraph of the Bryant statement, the one Evelyn had edited herself. The words stayed with him. This was not an isolated moment. It was the surface of something deeper, something quiet, polite, and dangerous. If you want to fix it, start by believing people when they tell you it's real. Then act like it. He leaned back in his chair, letting the sentence settle. His assistant had asked earlier if they should prepare a press release, a media strategy, some coordinated posts across social channels. He had said no. "Let the apology be simple," he told her. "Let the change be loud." Back in the taxi, Evelyn rested her head lightly against the window. Harold's hand found hers on the seat between them. She turned her palm to meet his, and for a few minutes, neither of them said anything. It was not the first time they had been disrespected. It would not be the last time someone underestimated them. But something about today felt different. This time they hadn't been expected to fight. They hadn't been forced to shout. This time the world had leaned in and listened. At that same moment, In a small apartment on the other side of town, Kendra Harper sat at her kitchen table, a half-drunk cup of coffee growing cold beside her. Her phone had been silent for hours. No calls from HR, no outreach from her colleagues. Just a wall of stillness. On her screen, the news was everywhere. The story had been picked up nationally. Flight attendant removed mid-flight after elderly couple removed without cause. She read the headline 3 times. The comments underneath were brutal. This is why people don't trust airlines. It's always the quiet racism. Imagine doing this to a couple who helped build the company you work for. She turned off the screen, stood slowly, and looked at her reflection in the kitchen window. She didn't recognize herself. For the first time, she wondered what the Bryants had seen when she looked at them the way she did. Not as people, but as suspicions. She lowered her eyes and whispered, "I didn't see them." But now it was too late not to. Back in the cab, Harold looked over at his wife. "What do we do next?" Evelyn looked straight ahead. "We wait," she said, "and we watch what they do when no one's looking." The following morning, the world had changed in quiet but unmistakable ways. By the time the sun filtered through the windows of Harold and Evelyn's home, the story had spread far beyond the confines of social media threads and airline reports. News channels were running the headline on repeat. Respected elderly couple removed from first-class seats sparks national outrage. Accompanying the reports were snapshots, not of chaos or confrontation, but of stillness. Harold standing with his cane, Evelyn clutching her shawl, both of them composed, dignified, and unmistakably wronged. The media wasn't focused on yelling or lawsuits. The power of the story came from its quiet truth, the grace with which 2 people held themselves when their worth had been questioned, and the way an entire flight had watched it happen. At the breakfast table, Evelyn sipped her tea, flipping through channels without stopping. Every station had a panel. Anchors debated how incidents like this continued to happen. Analysts spoke on unconscious bias. Civil rights advocates reminded the public that this wasn't about one couple. It was about how systems, both corporate and cultural, silently pushed people to the margins. Harold, dressed in his usual dark cardigan, sat across from her, reading an email on his tablet. "It's from the CEO's office," he said. Evelyn looked up. "And? They've confirmed the meeting for Friday. Senior leadership will be there. They've also asked if we'd be willing to share our recommendations for future staff training." Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "Only if they're serious about listening, not nodding politely. They've also offered to let us review their updated apology before it goes public," Harold added. Evelyn sighed. "They're learning. Slowly." At that same hour, inside the glass-walled boardroom of the airline's headquarters, tension sat thick in the air. Executives shifted in their seats as Robert Langston, the CEO, stood at the head of the table. He held the printed statement in his hand, eyes scanning the room. "This is not a PR crisis," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is a credibility crisis. If we fail to act boldly, we won't just lose customer trust, we'll lose the trust of our own employees." One executive, a woman with sharp glasses and a tablet full of stats, spoke up. "The numbers are already changing. We've seen a spike in cancellations from loyalty members, and dozens of former customers are demanding to know how we're responding. Silence isn't an option." Robert turned to Marcus, seated quietly at the side of the room, hands folded. "You were on that flight. You saw it all. What do you recommend?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Full transparency, not just with the statement. We need an independent audit of our customer service practices, every incident report involving perceived bias. We need to publish the findings." Someone scoffed softly. Robert turned. "You disagree?" "No, sir," the man replied. "Just, that'll be a storm." Marcus's voice was quiet but clear. "That storm has already started. We either get soaked standing still or move through it and come out clean." The room fell silent. Later that afternoon, the airline released a formal public statement. "To our passengers, our staff, and the public. On Flight 894, Mr. and Mrs. Bryant, long-standing loyal customers, were removed from their rightful seats without just cause. We acknowledge that this act was rooted in an employee's personal judgment, not airline policy. While we cannot undo the harm caused, we are taking immediate, concrete steps to ensure it never happens again. This includes the full termination of the employee involved, an independent audit of past complaints related to discriminatory treatment, and a total overhaul of our training systems with direct guidance from those who have lived through the harm our systems failed to prevent. We thank the Bryants for their patience, their grace, and most of all, their honesty. We failed them, and we will not make that mistake again. The response was swift. The public commended the directness of the message. Civil rights organizations posted statements of cautious support. Several major companies applauded the airline's willingness to self-examine. Still, others were more reserved. "Words are cheap," one headline read. "Let's see what happens in 6 months." Meanwhile, Evelyn sat in the living room with her journal open, pen in hand. She didn't write much, just a few lines. "We were taken off a flight because someone didn't think we belonged, but we never left with our heads down. Sometimes the strongest protest is staying upright." Harold stepped in and placed his phone down. "Our niece called, said people at her university were discussing it in class today. The professor used it as an example of silent strength." Evelyn smiled gently. "Let them study it. Maybe they'll see what respect looks like when it's been earned and denied, and what it means when it's reclaimed." At that moment, they weren't thinking about headlines or hashtags or executive meetings. They were thinking about the next flight they'd take, the next time they'd walk down an aisle, the next time a stranger would look at them and have to ask themselves, "Do they belong here?" And maybe, just maybe, that answer would come a little faster next time, a little more certain, because the world had watched. And now the world remembered. By the end of the week, Harold and Evelyn stood once again inside the glass walls of the airline's headquarters. This time not as customers, but as consultants, witnesses, and quiet revolutionaries. They were greeted at the front by Alicia and led through a series of private corridors. Not for show, but to ensure the press, now gathered outside the building, wouldn't turn this into a spectacle. The Bryants hadn't given interviews. They hadn't signed any deals. They'd refused all offers to sell their story. They wanted only one thing: change that lasted longer than a news cycle. Inside the executive conference hall, every major department head sat waiting. The CEO, Robert Langston, stood as they entered. No handshakes, no pretense, just a gesture toward 2 seats placed deliberately at the head of the table. Harold and Evelyn sat down quietly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Robert cleared his throat and began. "We've reviewed your recommendations, every word, and I want to start today by thanking you, not for your patience, though that deserves recognition, but for your refusal to accept silence. That refusal has forced this company to confront truths we've ignored for too long." He gestured toward a folder in front of every executive. "In those packets, you'll find our new protocol, drafted in consultation with external equity advisors, revised policy enforcers, and frontline staff. But I want you to hear the core of it directly, because it came from this couple here." He paused, then read aloud. "Respect cannot be conditional. Dignity is not earned by tone, attire, or travel status. It is owed, immediately and without compromise, the moment a person walks through our doors." The room remained still. Robert looked at Harold. "We'd be honored if you would speak." Harold stood, his cane in one hand, the other resting gently on the back of his chair. His voice, though aged, carried easily through the room. "I'm not here to thank anyone for doing what's right. I'm here because this isn't about my wife and me anymore. It's about every person who's ever been looked at like they didn't belong. Every person who sat in silence after being judged for how they looked, spoke, or simply existed." He paused, then turned slowly, letting his gaze meet the eyes of everyone in the room. "My wife and I didn't cause a scene because we didn't have to. The world caused it for us. But next time, and there will be a next time, someone may not have the patience we do. Someone may be tired, hurt, angry. And when that happens, don't ask why they're so upset. Ask what you missed when you had the chance to do something." He sat back down. His words settled in like weight on the room. Evelyn didn't speak this time. She didn't need to. Her presence, her grace, her very being. It was enough. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Protocols were reviewed. Questions were asked. Evelyn made sure the staff training didn't just include policies, but scenarios. Real ones. Harold insisted the audit results be made public, no matter what they revealed. They both agreed that the real measure of change wouldn't be in press releases, but in the way people were treated when no one with a camera was watching. When the meeting ended, no one rushed to shake hands. The room wasn't filled with applause or congratulations. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was more sacred than celebratory. Quiet progress, earned, not gifted. Later that afternoon, the public statement was released with one final addition, written by Evelyn herself. We do not seek fame, nor did we intend to lead a movement. We simply wanted to fly home. But sometimes justice finds you in ordinary places, and when it does, your silence either protects the system or challenges it. We chose to challenge it. That sentence was shared more than 1,000,000 times. 3 months later, Harold and Evelyn boarded another plane. Same airline, same route, same seats in business class. But this time, something had changed. The attendant who greeted them at the door, a young man named Theo, didn't just smile. He offered to help with Harold's cane, called them by name without checking the manifest, and personally walked them to their seats. Thank you, Evelyn said, a little surprised. Theo's response was simple. We've learned a lot, ma'am, because of you. As they settled into their seats, passengers nodded respectfully, some recognizing them, others just sensing their presence was something to honor. There were no whispers this time, no stares, no quiet doubts. Julia, now promoted to cabin lead, came by with 2 cups of tea before the drink cart had even rolled out. I made sure it was fresh, she said, with lemon and a little honey, just how you like it. Harold smiled. You remembered. She returned a proud smile of her own. We all did. The plane lifted off into a clear sky, and for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt the kind of peace she used to feel when flying. Not because the seats were wide or the service was good, but because no one was asking her to prove that she belonged. She reached into her purse, pulled out her journal, and opened to a blank page. She wrote, "They tried to take our seats, but we never gave up our place." Then she looked out the window, rested her hand on Harold's, and whispered, "Let's go home." And this time they did, with nothing hanging above them, with nothing left to defend. They didn't win by fighting, they won by standing still, long enough for the world to move. If this story touched you, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this.